George was a young man full of dreams and determination, having graduated with honors from the University of Abuja. He had hoped his stellar academic performance would land him a well-paying job, but life seemed to have other plans. Despite countless job applications and interviews, doors remained closed, leaving him frustrated and disheartened. Eventually, George realized he needed to find a way to survive, so he took a job with a rideshare company to make ends meet. At first, he thought this was a temporary fix, a way to keep going until he could find something better. But as the months passed, George found a strange sense of comfort in the routine of driving. The job allowed him to meet new people daily, each with a story, each teaching him something. Before he knew it, days turned into years, and George was still behind the wheel, working tirelessly to provide for himself. One day he picked up a passenger named Angela. She was kind, warm, and had a smile that made George forget his troubles, even if only for a moment. They struck up a conversation that flowed effortlessly, and by the end of the ride, George knew he had to see her again. Over time, their bond grew, and soon they were inseparable. Angela believed in George, even when he doubted himself, and her unwavering support became his anchor. Not long after, they married in a modest ceremony and built a humble life together. They were soon blessed with 2 children, a boy and a girl, who became the joy of George's life. Angela chose to be a full-time housewife, pouring her heart into raising their kids and creating a warm, loving home. But with only George's income to sustain them, their finances were stretched thin, and George felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. Driven by love for his family, George worked tirelessly, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and sometimes even sleep. Every penny mattered, and he gave everything to ensure his family never lacked basic needs. There were moments of exhaustion when he would glance at his reflection in the rearview mirror, wondering if he would ever escape this cycle. But thoughts of Angela and the kids motivated him, reminding him that he was doing it all for them. Years passed, and while they didn't live lavishly, George and Angela's home was filled with love and laughter. His children were growing up to be kind, compassionate, and grateful, values he and Angela instilled in them. The year had ended, and it was Christmas season. Even though George wanted badly to spend time with his wife and kids, he knew the festive season was a cash cow in his industry. After breakfast, as the children excitedly spoke about their Christmas wishes and Angela prepared their holiday meal, George felt the familiar tug of guilt. He had promised to take the day off, to be there for his family, but the mounting bills that had been sitting on the kitchen table, along with the rent, electricity, and school fees, weighed heavily on him. The money he earned that day would greatly help them offset some of those expenses, allowing them to start the new year with less financial pressure. His kids, sensing his inner conflict, pleaded with him. "Daddy, please stay with us," his son Daniel said, tears welling up in his eyes. "We need you here." "Daddy, don't go." His daughter Lily added, her voice quivering, "We want to spend Christmas with you." Angela, too, shared a quiet, understanding look with him. She didn't say anything, but her gaze spoke volumes. She had always supported his work ethic, knowing that George's drive to provide for them was out of love. But she knew how much he needed this time with the family. However, the weight of their financial situation was undeniable. With a heavy heart, George stood up from the table, kissed his wife and kids on the forehead, and pulled on his jacket. "I'll be back soon," he promised softly, though he couldn't guarantee how soon. "This is just for today. We'll make up for it when I get back." He could see the disappointment in their eyes, and it hurt him more than he had anticipated. But as he walked out the door, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. Their long-term well-being depended on his sacrifices now. As soon as he started his car and turned on the rideshare driver app, a request came in, and George's phone buzzed almost instantly. He sighed, looking at the address. It was going to be a long day. He drove through the busy streets, his mind drifting between the love he had for his family and the financial burden that often shadowed his every move. The city was alive with holiday cheer, decorations twinkling everywhere, but inside his car, it was just him, the road, and his thoughts. Each passenger he picked up had their own story, some light-hearted, others more serious. George tried to make small talk, but the cheer around him felt like a distant echo. As much as he wanted to be home, he knew this sacrifice would help them, and that thought was what kept him going. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Christmas lights blinked on in homes along the streets, and families gathered together for their holiday celebrations. The thought of his family waiting for him, despite the tears earlier, gave him strength. He wasn't sure how much longer he could continue working this way, but for now, he would do it. For them. After a hard day's work, George counted the cash he had earned and felt a surge of relief and joy. He had made far more than he'd expected. People had been generous with their tips, appreciating his polite manner and engaging conversations. With this unexpected windfall, George decided to surprise his family with a few gifts. He stopped by a nearby store, picking out a beautiful scarf for Angela, a small remote-controlled car for Daniel, and a doll for Lily. As he was about to leave, his phone buzzed with another ride request. At first, he thought of ignoring it. He was exhausted and ready to head home. But when he glanced at the details, he noticed that the destination was on his route back. Figuring it wouldn't hurt to accept one last ride, George decided to take it. One more, and then home, he thought. When he arrived at the pickup location, a well-dressed woman stepped forward, holding a neatly wrapped package. Instead of getting into the car, she handed him the package and said, "Please deliver this package to the address listed on your app." She slipped a generous tip into his hand, smiling warmly. Surprised but appreciative, George accepted the task. Curious about the unusual request, George asked, "Is there anything specific I should know about delivering this?" The woman's eyes sparkled, and she replied mysteriously, "Just be careful with it. It's precious cargo." George nodded, reassured her it would be safe, and started the journey to the address. As he drove, he wondered about the contents of the package. There was something peculiar about the situation, but he brushed it off, focusing instead on the thought of reuniting with his family. When he reached the address, George parked in front of a modest house tucked in a quiet neighborhood not far from where he lived. He was excited that he would quickly drop off the package and soon be on his way home to spend some time with his family before midnight. But as George called the number on the package to come get their delivery, something unexpected happened. The man remotely opened a giant iron gate, revealing a massive, ornate mansion that took George's breath away. He had never seen a home so grand, with towering columns, elegant windows, and beautifully manicured gardens surrounding it. The mansion looked out of place in the quiet neighborhood, standing as a testament to wealth and opulence. George felt a flicker of awe, wondering what kind of people lived there. As George drove through the long, winding driveway, the front door swung open. A large man dressed in a Santa costume came out to greet him. His belly shook as he walked, and his deep voice boomed in the night air. "Merry Christmas, driver," the man said with a grin. "I'm Santa at your service." George smiled and handed over the package, noticing the man's jolly demeanor and friendly smile. "Merry Christmas," George replied. "Here's your delivery." The man, still smiling, shook George's hand. "Thank you for bringing this all the way here. You're a lifesaver." He then pressed a generous tip into George's hand, much more than he had expected for a simple delivery. But before George could turn to leave, the man waved him over. "Wait, don't go yet. It's Christmas after all. Why don't you come inside for a quick bite? And I've got some gifts for your wife and kids too." George hesitated for a moment, but the warmth in the man's voice, coupled with the festive atmosphere, made him feel comfortable. The house was stunning, and the man seemed so friendly. Just a quick bite, George thought. I haven't had time to celebrate with my family, but they'll understand. The man gestured for George to follow him inside, and George complied, curious but still not suspicious. As he entered the mansion, he was immediately struck by the luxurious interior. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, and elegant furniture that spoke of wealth and refinement. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The man led George into a large dining room where a beautiful Christmas feast was laid out. Roast meats, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and all sorts of desserts. The smell was intoxicating. "Come on, sit down," the man said, motioning to a seat at the table. "You've worked hard today. Let me treat you." George, feeling a little out of place but too polite to decline, sat down at the table. The man poured him a glass of wine and continued talking with such ease and charm that George felt at ease. They spoke about their families, about George's work, and the man told stories of his own family traditions. For a moment, it felt like George had been swept into a Christmas miracle. The warmth, the hospitality, and the kindness were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He felt grateful, almost blessed, to be treated so well by a complete stranger. But as he continued eating, a strange sensation crept over him. His head began to feel heavier, his vision blurred, and his limbs started to feel unnaturally weak. At first, he dismissed it as exhaustion from his long day of work, but soon the feeling intensified. It dawned on George something wasn't right. His stomach churned and he tried to stand up, but his legs refused to support him. He staggered, barely able to keep himself upright, before falling to the floor. Panic surged through him as he tried to gather his thoughts. His mind was clouded, but through the fog he managed to mutter weakly, "My wife, my kids, please." His voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough for the man in the Santa suit to notice. The man's smile faded, and he immediately beckoned for someone to help. Within moments, two men appeared from a side door, their faces cold and stern. They swiftly moved to George's side, lifting him up despite his feeble attempts to resist. They dragged him down a long hallway, past opulent rooms and luxurious decor, until they reached a set of heavy double doors. George's fading consciousness flickered with alarm as they opened the doors and revealed a cold, sterile surgical room. The floor was gleaming white, and medical equipment lined the walls. This wasn't a festive home, this was a place of business. The reality of his situation began to hit him as fear surged through his veins. The man who had welcomed George in, now no longer the jolly Santa he had appeared to be, stood by the doorway, watching with a cold smile. George's mind was clouded, but his instinct screamed at him to fight. What is this?" he managed to croak, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. The man's smile widened. "I've been looking for a match for months," he explained, stepping closer. "I've been sick for so long, and no one's been able to help me. But you, George, you're going to save me. I'm going to take your liver." George's heart hammered in his chest. His body felt like it was shutting down, and the man's words were the final confirmation of his nightmare. The man had lured him here with kindness, with gifts, with a warm meal, only to use him as a test subject for his sick, twisted plan. "Please," George whispered weakly, his body no longer obeying him. My family needs me." The man nodded solemnly as though he understood, but his expression was cold, detached. "I know, and this is the only way I can survive," he said. "You've been so kind, so generous, George. But this is the only way." The two men who had helped bring George into the room began preparing the medical equipment, setting up the surgical tools with practiced ease. George could barely keep his eyes open now, but the horror of what was happening gripped him with a final surge of adrenaline. He tried to speak, to shout, but his voice came out in desperate gasps. "Please, I don't want this," he begged, his voice barely audible. But the man was unmoved, already giving instructions to the men, who were now preparing to sedate him further. As they attached a needle to his arm, George's vision began to fade, his last thoughts being of his wife and kids. His family, the love of his life, and the life he had worked so hard to provide for. He wouldn't be there to protect them anymore. As the sedative took effect, George's body slipped into unconsciousness. The cold, clinical lights above flickered as the sterile instruments were brought to bear on his once healthy body. His liver, the only thing of value to the man who had lured him into this nightmare, was harvested with cruel precision. His lifeless body was then placed in his car, his limbs awkwardly positioned, and dumped by the side of a quiet road. No one would know, at least not immediately, what had been done to him. Back at home, Angela's heart sank as Christmas passed without George's return. She waited for him, calling his phone over and over, but it went unanswered. Each ring fueled her growing panic. She tried to remain hopeful, telling herself that George was just caught in traffic, or maybe his phone had died. But as the hours passed into morning, her fear began to consume her. She had no choice but to report George missing. The weight of her worry had become too much to bear. But just as she was about to leave the house to file the report, a chilling sight stopped her in her tracks. There, on the side of the road, she saw George's car, surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers. Her heart stopped as she rushed forward, fear rising in her chest. The moment she reached the car, she froze in horror. Inside, George's lifeless body lay sprawled across the seat, his eyes wide open, his body grotesquely mutilated. The stench of blood filled the air. Angela's world crumbled as she screamed, her cries echoing through the street. The bystanders who had gathered realized who she was and quickly offered their condolences, though they couldn't fathom the agony she was in. The police were called, and soon the scene was swarming with officers. They promised to investigate the murder, but Angela knew better. They had failed to solve any case in years. Her heart sank as she watched them take George's body away. She had no faith in their ability to bring his killer to justice, but in that moment, her sorrow turned to dread. What now? Without George, how would she provide for herself and their children? How would she survive without the man who had worked so tirelessly for their future? In the days that followed, Angela did what she could to hold herself together for the sake of her children. With a heavy heart, she sold George's car, the very thing that had kept their family afloat for so long, and used the money to arrange for his body to be returned to their village. But the reality of what lay ahead consumed her thoughts. How would she ever explain to his family that George had gone out to work one fateful day and never returned? How could she convey the horror that had befallen him? The drive back to the village was long, and the weight of the journey seemed to stretch on endlessly. Angela and her children sat silently in the back of the ambulance, the body of their beloved George lying cold in the front. The children, though young, understood something was wrong. They held each other close, their tears staining their cheeks as they leaned against their mother for comfort. Angela too wept softly, her heart aching for the life they had lost. Once they arrived in the village, the sight of the small, familiar place felt different. It was supposed to be a place of solace, of family, but now it felt like the sight of a painful goodbye. As they stepped out of the ambulance, Angela and her children were dressed in black. Their sorrow mirrored in the eyes of the relatives who gathered to mourn with them. The village was quiet, the air heavy with grief. Angela held her children close, trying to remain strong despite the overwhelming sadness. The world around them seemed to blur as she fought to steady her breath, knowing that the life she had once known would never be the same again. A grave had already been dug, waiting solemnly in the soft red earth. As the ambulance came to a halt and George's body was carefully lowered, the weight of grief hung thick in the air. According to the customs of their village, there was no delay. The burial would happen immediately. Angela's heart felt like it was breaking with every handful of soil that fell over George's coffin. Tears streamed down her face, but beneath her sorrow, there was something deeper, a burning anger and an unshakable resolve. As the final prayers were being said, Angela stepped forward, her eyes red and swollen but fierce with purpose. In her hand, she held a machete, one of George's old tools from his days working on their small farm. Without hesitation, she lifted it high above her head, the sharp blade glinting beneath the sun. With a force driven by heartbreak, she flung the machete into the grave, the metal landing with a dull thud atop George's casket. Silence fell over the mourners. Her voice trembled but rang out clear and strong, echoing across the cemetery. George, do not rest until those who did this to you are revealed. May their nights be haunted and their days filled with torment until they confess their evil deeds. The villagers, moved by her pain, raised their hands to the sky and shouted in unison, Amen. The ground seemed to hum with the weight of their voices, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the very earth mourned alongside them. After spending some time with George's family, Angela knew it was time to return to the city. The village had offered her comfort, but the weight of reality pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had children to care for and a future to rebuild. But how? George had been their provider, the anchor that kept their family afloat. Without him, Angela felt adrift, drowning in uncertainty. Bills piled up. Food became scarce. The life they had shared now seemed distant, like a fading memory she couldn't hold on to. Nights were the hardest. As the children slept, Angela would sit alone, staring at George's empty chair, whispering prayers for strength. But while Angela fought her battles in the living world, George's spirit could not rest. From the realm beyond, George watched over his wife and children, his heart heavy with rage and sorrow. The injustice of his death burned deep within him. He could not let his killers escape. In the cold shadows of the mansion where he had been lured to his death, the man who stole George's organs began to feel the weight of something unseen. At first it was subtle, a whisper in the wind, flickering lights, objects slightly out of place. But soon, Frank began to make his presence known. The man would glance into a mirror only to see George staring back at him. Hollow eyes filled with quiet fury bore into his soul. "You can't escape me," George's voice echoed, even though his mouth never moved. The first time, the man dismissed it as exhaustion. But the visions did not stop. Every reflective surface became a gateway, and George's face was always waiting on the other side. He watched him. At night, the torment grew worse. George entered his dreams, standing silently at the foot of his bed, his shadow stretching across the room. The man woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding uncontrollably. Sleeping pills offered no relief. No matter how much he took, George was always there. The man's health began to deteriorate rapidly, his once confident demeanor replaced by paranoia and fear. One evening, desperate for peace, the man smashed every mirror in his house. But George's reflection didn't need glass. He appeared in the man's nightmares, in the still water of his sink, in the dark glass of his phone. George's spirit whispered relentlessly, "Confess, confess, confess." The man's grip on reality began to slip. Terrified and broken, he knew that no matter how far he ran, George would follow. For a week, George's presence grew stronger, more intense. His anger was unrelenting. From the great beyond, he reached out and began to torment the man who had stolen his life. Whenever the man stepped outside, he would feel the sting of an invisible whip strike across his body. The searing pain would cause him to stagger, falling to his knees in agony, but there was no one around to see the cause. People would stare, confused and frightened, as the man ran through the streets, screaming in pain, looking like a man tormented by invisible forces. His clothes were torn and his face a mask of desperation, but no one could understand the madness that had gripped him. He was desperate, pleading with anyone who would listen, but George's spirit would not relent. Each time the man tried to escape, the phantom whips would strike again, each blow more painful than the last. The man, now broken and unstable, had no choice but to do the unthinkable. In a moment of overwhelming fear, he turned to the only place he thought could offer him some relief. He took to a live stream. Shaking and barely able to control his trembling hands, the man went live on social media. His audience, initially puzzled, quickly realized that something was terribly wrong as he broke down in front of the camera. With tears streaming down his face, he confessed to his crimes. His voice cracked as he admitted to killing George for the sole purpose of harvesting his organs. He spoke of the deal he had made and the pain that followed, revealing the extent of his greed and cruelty. "Please, I didn't want to do it," he sobbed, "but now I can't escape him. I can't sleep. I can't think. He's tormenting me. Please forgive me." And in an act that would forever change Angela's life, the man, barely able to breathe from the weight of his guilt, transferred $10 million into an account in Angela's name. Meanwhile, Angela had reached her lowest point. Starving, struggling to make ends meet, she was preparing to sell her smartphone just to afford a meal for herself and her children. She had no choice. Without George's income, everything was slipping through her fingers. Just as she was about to part with the phone, the screen lit up with an incoming call. It was her friend, but Angela wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Angela," her friend said urgently, "you need to watch the news right now. George's killer, he's confessed. It's all over the live stream." Angela's heart skipped a beat. Confessed? Could this really be true? Her hands trembling, she quickly opened the live stream and watched in stunned silence as the man who had stolen her husband's life confessed to the gruesome crime. Angela's eyes filled with tears as she heard the man admit his wrongdoings, and then, almost as if by miracle, she saw the transfer notification of $10 million sent directly to her account. It was more money than she could ever have imagined. But even with the wealth, the sorrow in her heart couldn't be erased. George was gone. Yet this confession, this gift, somehow felt like a small, bitter piece of justice. Angela sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the turn of events. The anger, the heartbreak, and the confusion swirled inside her, but one thing was clear. George's spirit had not let his killer escape. He had made sure the truth came out, and somehow Angela knew that even in death, her husband was watching over them. The man's confession spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of authorities and the public. The case, once thought to be another unsolved tragedy, now became a national headline. With overwhelming evidence from his own live stream and the testimonies of those who had witnessed his bizarre public outbursts, the man was swiftly arrested and put on trial. Angela, still grieving but now financially stable, attended every court session. She sat quietly, holding on to George's memory, her heart heavy but resolute. The courtroom was packed, and the weight of justice hung thick in the air as the trial proceeded. The man's defense crumbled under the weight of his own confession. No plea for leniency could erase the cruelty of his actions. The judge, unmoved by his tearful apologies, delivered the final verdict, death by hanging. As the gavel struck, Angela felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and closure. Nothing could bring George back, but knowing his killer would face justice gave her some peace. When the trial ended, Angela stepped outside, the sunlight warming her face. Her children stood by her side, their hands wrapped tightly around hers. "Daddy got justice," her son whispered, looking up at her. Angela nodded, fighting back tears as she kissed his forehead. "Yes, he did," she replied softly. Though George was gone, his love, strength, and the justice he fought for from beyond would forever live on in their hearts. Though George was gone, his spirit ensured that his family found closure and financial stability. Angela left the courtroom feeling a sense of relief, as though justice had finally been served. But what she didn't know was that the woman who had booked George for that ill-fated ride, the very woman who had sent him to the mansion, was far from innocent. She was, in fact, George's killer's wife, and she had been part of the dark plan all along. As Angela stood in the courtroom, feeling vindicated, the woman sat in the back, her eyes filled with fury. Her husband's conviction shattered her world, and as the sentence of death by hanging was handed down, she wept bitterly. It wasn't just the loss of her husband that tore at her, it was the humiliation. The woman's mind, consumed by rage and revenge, began to plot a dark course. She vowed to make Angela pay for her husband's downfall. With the bitterness of losing her husband to justice fueling her every thought, she began to devise a way to get back at the woman who had unknowingly torn her world apart. Meanwhile, Angela's life, though still marked by the sorrow of losing George, was beginning to stabilize. The financial windfall she had received from her husband's killer's confession allowed her to provide her children with a better future. She enrolled them in the best schools and moved them to a safer, more comfortable neighborhood. Though the pain of George's death never fully went away, Angela found solace in the new opportunities life was offering her. She didn't squander the money. Instead, she lived frugally, choosing to invest in her children's education and future. Her focus was on ensuring they never had to experience the struggles she had faced. She was careful with every penny, making sure her newfound wealth would last. But as she settled into this new chapter, she had no idea that lurking in the shadows was a vengeful woman, determined to destroy everything Angela had worked for. George watched helplessly from the spirit world as Angela's life slowly moved forward. He could see the danger that lurked around her, the vengeful woman watching from the shadows. But no matter how hard he tried to communicate, Angela couldn't see or hear him. It frustrated him beyond words. He whispered warnings in her ear, stood beside her as she slept, and even tried to write messages in the condensation on the bathroom mirror. But nothing worked. Unlike the man who had taken his life, Angela wasn't haunted by guilt or darkness, and that made it nearly impossible for George to reach her. He watched helplessly from the spirit world, his presence lingering like a shadow over his family. He saw the woman, his killer's wife, watching Angela from afar, her eyes cold and calculating. George tried to call out to Angela, but his voice was nothing more than a whisper lost to the wind. "Angela, she's dangerous. Please don't trust her," George pleaded as he stood next to her one evening while she tucked the children into bed. Angela sat by her daughter's side, brushing her hair gently. She hummed softly, completely unaware of George's voice or the weight of his spirit lingering by her side. "George, I wish you were here," she whispered to herself. George knelt beside her, reaching out to touch her face, but his hand passed through her like smoke. Frustration grew in his chest. He had to find a way to warn her, but how? Days passed, and Angela carried on with life, gradually stepping back into the world, attending school meetings, running errands, and occasionally sitting by George's grave to talk to him in silence. But as peaceful as her days appeared, George could feel the tension building around her. One afternoon, as Angela waited in her car outside the school to pick up her children, a man approached with a warm smile. Tall, well-dressed and confident, he exuded charm. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, tapping on her window. Angela looked up, startled at first, but then rolled the window down slightly. "Yes. I couldn't help but notice your car. It's a beautiful model. I have one just like it," he said with a friendly grin. Angela chuckled softly. "Oh, really? Small world. I'm David," he extended his hand. "My son goes to the same school. I've seen you around." Angela hesitated briefly, but then shook his hand. "Angela, nice to meet you." From a distance, George watched carefully. There was something about this man that felt off. His charm seemed too polished, too rehearsed. "I don't like this," George muttered, pacing beside the car. "Angela, don't let him in." But Angela didn't hear him. David leaned against the car, continuing to chat casually. "It's not easy doing this alone, is it?" Referring to the loss of her husband, a topic that came up during the conversation. Angela's smile faded just a little, but she nodded. "No, it's not. But you find a way to keep moving." George stepped forward, trying again. "Angela, listen to me. Look at his eyes. He's too smooth. There's something wrong with him. Maybe we could get some coffee sometime," David suggested, his eyes flickering with a hint of something beneath the charm. Angela hesitated. I don't really have time these days." "Oh, just as friends," David added quickly. "No pressure." Before Angela could respond, her children came running toward the car. "Mommy," they called out, waving excitedly. David smiled at them. "Beautiful kids, you must be proud." Angela nodded, unlocking the car. "I am. It was nice meeting you, David." As she drove off, George stood in the street, watching David with narrowed eyes. David's smile faded the moment Angela's car disappeared around the corner. His expression grew cold, and without a word, he turned and walked briskly toward another car parked nearby. George followed, materializing in the passenger seat of David's vehicle. He stared hard at David, anger simmering in his chest. "Who are you, really?" George demanded, knowing full well David couldn't hear him. David sat silently for a few moments before pulling out his phone. "She took the bait," he muttered, dialing a number. "I'll keep getting close. She won't see it coming." George's spirit tensed. "I knew it," he growled. That night, Angela sat by the fireplace, sipping tea while her children played nearby. George stood at the edge of the room, watching, feeling the weight of the secret he couldn't share. "I need to stop him," George whispered to himself. "But how?" A sudden thought struck him. Angela couldn't hear him, but there was one person who might. His daughter. George knelt by her as she played with her dolls. He gently whispered into her ear. "Jasmine, Daddy needs you to listen," George whispered softly, his spirit barely able to make the words clear. His daughter's small face brightened as she listened intently, her doll forgotten in her hands. "Tell Mummy, she is in trouble," George urged. "She needs to be careful of David." Jasmine's eyes widened, and without hesitation she sprang to her feet. Her little feet padded quickly as she ran to the living room, where Angela was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. "Mummy, Mummy," Jasmine called, her voice full of urgency. She tugged at Angela's sleeve, her face serious. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Angela asked, lowering the magazine and looking at her daughter with a warm, though tired smile. "Daddy says you're in trouble," Jasmine exclaimed. "He says you need to be careful of David." Angela's face faltered for a moment. She blinked, unsure of how to react. "Jasmine, sweetie, what are you talking about?" Angela said softly, brushing her daughter's hair back. "Your daddy's gone. He can't talk to you." Jasmine's brow furrowed, confusion clouding her small face. "But he did, Mummy. I heard him." Angela sighed, sitting back into the couch. She had been expecting something like this. It wasn't unusual for children to go through phases where they imagined their loved ones speaking to them after they'd passed. "Jasmine," Angela began gently, "I know you miss Daddy, but he's not here anymore. It's just your imagination, okay? There's nothing to worry about." "Okay, Mummy," she said. George, watching this unfold from the spirit world, felt the sorrow of being so close to his family, yet unable to protect them. His anger flared, and his frustration turned to desperation. He couldn't reach Angela, not directly, but he wasn't about to give up. He just had to find another way. As days passed, Angela, unaware of the looming danger, continued to see more of David. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Simple conversations, friendly exchanges. But over time, David became a more regular presence in her life. He offered to help with errands, school runs, and even fixing things around the house. His charm never wavered, and slowly Angela allowed him into her life, seeing him as a confidant, someone who understood her struggles. She was beginning to like him, and slowly she began to discuss the money she had received from the settlement. David seemed smart, business-savvy, and comfortable discussing financial matters. Angela, still adjusting to the new wealth in her life, felt a sense of relief in talking to someone who appeared to have the knowledge to help her manage it wisely. "Have you thought about investing the money, Angela?" David asked one evening as they sat in the living room of her home, sipping coffee. "A wealth management company could help you set up an investment portfolio, grow the funds, and ensure financial security for you and your children." Angela smiled, relieved to have someone who seemed to understand her financial situation. "I've thought about it, but I'm not really sure who to trust, you know?" David leaned in, his voice soft and reassuring. "Trust me, I've been working with this company for years. They're reputable, and they'll take good care of your investment. You've been through so much, Angela, and you deserve peace of mind." As the days passed, David continued to reassure her, presenting the wealth management company as a legitimate and promising opportunity. But all the while, his real intentions remained hidden. It was a scam, a carefully planned scheme to take advantage of Angela's grief and vulnerability and siphon off her newfound wealth. George watched from beyond, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness and anger as David manipulated Angela into beginning the process of signing documents that would transfer the money. George's spirit seethed with rage. On the night of the final deal, when Angela was scheduled to sign the contract and send the money to the supposed wealth management company, George's anger reached its boiling point. He would not let David steal from his family. No, not this time. As the paperwork lay on the table in front of Angela, ready for her signature, George appeared in the room, a shadow of fury in the corner of her eye. Without warning, a crackling sound echoed through the room. A heavy whip materialized in George's spectral hands, and he swung it down with force. The lash echoed like thunder through the room. David yelped in shock as the whip struck him. The room filled with a ghostly energy, the crack of the whip growing louder with every strike. David recoiled in terror, his eyes wide with disbelief. What is happening?" he shouted, stumbling back in panic. The invisible whip continued to lash at him, each strike more intense than the last. David's fear deepened, his face pale with fright. He stumbled backwards, his legs tripping over the rug, and he turned toward the door, desperate to escape. No, I'm leaving! I'm leaving!" David screamed, his voice high-pitched with panic. He bolted for the door, slamming it behind him as he ran into the night. Angela stood frozen, wide-eyed and speechless, watching the scene unfold. She had heard nothing, seen nothing, but felt the oppressive energy in the room, the sense of something powerful and vengeful that had just made its presence known. She shook her head, trying to process what had just happened. What on earth had just occurred? She was still shaken but managed to drive back to the house, still unsure whether she'd imagined everything. But as she walked in, her daughter Jasmine, who had been in her room, came rushing toward her. "Mummy, Mummy!" Jasmine exclaimed, her little face full of urgency. Daddy told me to tell you that he was the one who flogged David and made him run away." Angela froze. Her heart skipped a beat and a chill ran through her spine. How could Jasmine know that? How could she have known? "What did you say, sweetie?" Angela asked, kneeling down to her daughter's level, her voice trembling. Jasmine looked up at her mother with serious eyes. "Daddy told me. He said he was the one who flogged David so he would run away." Angela's breath caught in her throat. She blinked rapidly, her mind racing. But how did you hear him, darling?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jasmine looked up, wide-eyed. "He's always talking to me, Mummy. He says he's with us, watching over us. He wants to protect us. And he told me to tell you that he made David run away." Angela's heart pounded in her chest. It was impossible, she thought, but looking into her daughter's innocent face, she couldn't deny it any longer. There was no way Jasmine could have known about what had just happened unless it was true. The pieces started falling into place, and Angela's fear began to turn into realization. George, even after death, had been protecting her. His love and spirit had not left them. Angela reached for her daughter, pulling her close. "Oh, my darling, I believe you," she whispered through tears. "I believe you." At that moment, Angela knew with every fiber of her being that her husband's love had never truly left. He was still there, watching over them, guiding them, even from the other side. Through their daughter, George eventually told Angela what transpired that night and the role he played in bringing his killer to justice. It was Jasmine who, once again, became the bridge between the living and the dead. "Daddy says I should tell you everything, Mummy. He says you need to know about David and his plan." Angela's heart tightened. She had known something wasn't right with David, but hearing Jasmine speak these words as if they were coming straight from George's spirit made the truth feel even more unsettling. Jasmine continued, "Daddy says David was the brother of the woman whose husband killed him. She was behind everything. She wanted to take the money you got, Mummy. She wanted to hurt you and hurt us." Angela felt a chill run down her spine. She had always suspected there was more to David than met the eye, but the realization that he had been connected to her husband's killer and that his intentions had been to harm her and their children hit her like a bolt of lightning. She sat down slowly, trying to process what her daughter was saying. "Jasmine, are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jasmine nodded. "Daddy says you're not safe here. He says you should leave the city. Go somewhere far away where you and the kids can start fresh." "He said to me," Jasmine said. Angela's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about survival. George, even from the afterlife, wanted to protect them, wanted them to be free from the shadows of the danger that had haunted their lives. "Leave," Angela repeated, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. "But where will we go? How will we survive?" Jasmine placed her hand on her mother's, offering her a sense of calm in the midst of the storm. "Daddy says you'll be okay. He says you've been strong enough to handle everything so far. You just have to trust him. You have to trust that it's time to go." Angela closed her eyes, her heart heavy with grief and fear, but also a profound sense of gratitude for the guidance George continued to provide. She realized that the money she had inherited from his passing wasn't just a blessing. It was a means to start over, to leave the past behind, and to protect her children from any more harm. Meanwhile, George, from the spirit world, continued to torment the killers and their accomplices. His presence was relentless, driving them to the brink of insanity. His spirit appeared before them, whipping them with the same fury he had unleashed on David. His whispers in their ears were unrelenting, forcing them to confront their sins. It didn't take long for the killer's wife and David to crack under the pressure, confessing to their horrific deeds. In the courtroom, their confessions echoed through the air, and the judge, though grim, ensured they were sentenced to life in prison. The system had finally caught up with them, thanks to George's unwavering spirit and the power of his love for his family. As for Angela and her children, they boarded a flight to the UK, determined to leave behind the haunting memories of their past. There, they began a fresh start. New opportunities, new friends, and a new life. They settled in a quiet town where Angela found peace, knowing she had done the best she could for her children. Although the pain of losing George would never completely fade, she now felt a sense of safety and hope for the future. And so, with justice served, and the weight of years of anguish lifted, George's spirit finally rested. His family was safe, his killers were brought to justice, and the love that had transcended death had ensured they would carry on, strong and unbroken.